All right, now I want to turn to what is, I think, the really interesting side of the story, which the price support policy allows us to talk about. Why do governments, and now we've got a whole series of policies that the governments might put into place, price supports, minimum wages, unionization, tariffs on imports, all of these have been shown to be detrimental to the markets overall and to lead to more harm than good. And yet governments are regularly inclined to put policies like this into place. So why is that? What is it? What's the interface between the economics of the situation and what economists suggest, should be the effects of different things and the political side of things? How are the political decisions made, especially in a democratic economy like the United States? Okay, and when we talk about that, we're entering into a new area or new discipline, which is called political economy. And this just refers to the interaction between politics and economics. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about what might motivate governments to make choices like this. And my first rejoinder, my first answer to this question that I'm posing, but my first answer would be, well, the government doesn't really listen to economists. And this is true to some extent when you listen to politicians talk about the economy, as I have done for my entire career. It is not uncommon for me to listen to politicians talk about things and think they don't really know what they're talking about. It's like they've never taken an economics lesson before. They haven't thought through all of the implications of different policies. And so maybe one reason is that they just don't listen to economists. And by the way, one reason for that might be because of the way we present things in economics. I mean, all of you are sitting in your first economics class for most of you, and you're seeing how economists present ideas. We put up a graph with a supply and demand curve, and then we work out surplus effects and this and that. And for a lot of people, maybe yourselves included, your eyes just glaze over and you start to go, I don't really understand what's going on. Okay? And to the extent that that's true, people don't listen to economists very much because it's complicated and so forth. So maybe that's one reason. But quite honestly, that's probably not the real reason. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight some of the political economy issues by highlighting the writings of this particular individual. Mansur Olson is his name. And he was an economist at the University of Maryland for a long time. He died at a young age of 66 in 1998. But he had a couple of very influential works and ideas that continue to frame how we think about political economy issues in particular. Now, his blockbuster book, if you will, for policymakers is called The Logic of Collective Action, and it was written and released in 1965. If you have a chance to read or you want to, increase your understanding of political economy issues, it's a good start, and I would suggest, you to pick it up at some point and take a look at it. But I'm going to give you the very, the points it's making is pretty straightforward and pretty simple to understand. So let me get to that now. He talks in the book about collective action. And collective action, in essence, refers to lobbying the government for policies that might work in your particular favor. But it's also referring to groups like labor unions. So anytime you're trying to get an organization that's going to try to represent the interests of a group of people, that group is called a collective, and you're trying to take action that's going to help the collective group receive some benefits. And that can happen in lobbying. That happens when labor unions represent workers at the management of firms and so forth and so on. So it's not just maybe lobbying, but it also occurs in other contexts as well. Now, Olson asked a fundamental question. And if I phrase it in a particular way, it might lead you to think one thing. So for example, we have a democracy. And the number of votes, the majority opinion tends to dominate and rule decisions, right? So if you can get a majority of people to agree to something, you can achieve certain things in a democracy. So with that in mind, let's consider different sizes of collective action groups and think about whether big groups, large size groups, or small size groups are more likely to be influential in a democratic system. Now, given the way I just started the premise, democracy, you need a majority in order to get things done. So that would seem to suggest that the bigger the group that's pushing for a particular action, the more likely that group is going to be to win. And so we might expect In a democracy, bigger group interests are going to be overwhelm small group interests. But his answer is actually the opposite. He says that small groups are more effective than large groups in a democracy. All right? So let's try to understand why he's saying the opposite is true. So the reason is down here. Large groups suffer from what we would call coordination problems and free riding. So let's talk a little bit about those. A coordination problem is, how do you get a group of people with a shared interest to participate in a collective action? Okay, how do you get them to participate? And participate might mean donate some of their money, paying union dues, for example, or getting them to contribute to your particular interest group, or getting them to participate and spend time, volunteering their time maybe. How do you get them to act? That's a coordination problem. And the bigger the group, the more problem it's going to have to try to motivate the interests of all of those individuals. So if the self-interest of each member is large, it's going to be easier to do. So if each person individually has a big interest in the collective action, then they're more likely to volunteer, contribute money, contribute their time. But if their individual interest is relatively small, and we're going to look at that in a minute, then it's going to be more difficult to coordinate the activities of this large group of people. And then there's a second issue, which is free riders. If a few people volunteer to support the collective action interests, the interest of this collective, then a lot of individuals might say, you know, they're doing a good job and I don't really want to interfere. And I don't really want to contribute my money. I'm supporting their actions maybe, but I don't have the time, I don't have the money to contribute, and I'm just going to sit back and hope that they're successful, because if they're successful, I'm a part of that group and will benefit from their activities, but I'm not willing to contribute. And that's what a free rider is. It's kind of like you're riding on the actions of others and hoping that they're going to solve the problem for you rather than you having to do it yourself. Now, think about large groups versus small groups. Which is more likely to suffer from a free rider problem? The answer, according to Olson, is large groups. Large groups are going to have a lot more people who could sit back and say, well, you know, those 10 people, they're doing a pretty good job. We're just going to leave them alone, and I'm going to hope for the best. And so the bigger the group, the harder it's going to be to arrest or prevent the free riding problem from taking effect. All right. Now, if you're a small group, you can coordinate your activities easier because, one, you know who everybody is. It's small enough for you to recognize who all of your the members are. And you can monitor whether they're actively supporting your effort or not supporting your effort. And you could put some public social pressure on them and say, hey, look, you know, 50% of us are contributing to this. We see you're not. You really, because you're going to benefit from this action as well, you really should participate. And so if the group is small enough, you can coordinate easier, and you can eliminate the free rider problem. It's still there, but it's going to be to a lesser degree with a smaller group than with a larger group. So Olson's conclusion, small groups are more effective in lobbying than large groups. Now let's see how this plays out. In our economic model so far, we've looked at a bunch of different policies. And one thing that's really important to recognize is that virtually everything the government does is going to create winners and losers. Some are going to benefit from that policy, some are going to lose. And that's true even if you do nothing. If you do nothing relative to doing something, some people are going to benefit from doing nothing, some are going to lose from doing nothing rather than something else. So there are always going to be these winners and losers whose interests have to be weighed in making particular policy decisions or taking policy actions. All right, now, how do we classify our different groups in our model so far? Really simply, in an economy, we can break them down into producers, consumers, and taxpayers. Now, producers are relatively small in size and are not often perfectly competitive where you've got hundreds of thousands or millions of firms operating in an industry, but rather we have an awful lot of producing sectors, businesses, that have a relatively small number of firms in the industry. They're concentrated. They may have indeed monopoly power in that particular way. And the numbers of firms in many industries might be as little as, say, 10 to 1,000, or maybe even 10,000 on the biggish side. But in comparison to the other groups, like consumers in the US economy, for example, is huge. The consumers of many products are going to number in the millions to hundreds of millions. So the number of consumer groups are a large size group with respect to most products in most industries, at least relative to the producers, the firms who are producing those individual products. And the same thing can be said for taxpayers. Taxpayers are large in size. There's, almost all adults pay taxes in one form or another, and mostly in lots of different forms. All right, so there's no way to avoid taxes if you're an adult in an economy in the United States or anywhere in the world. And so if we say, well, how many people are actually paying taxes? It's in the hundreds of millions in the United States, no doubt. All right, so huge group of taxpayers. All right, so let's apply Mansur Olson's theory here to our particular case of price supports and see how this might play out. All right, so here I'm going to do what I'm calling a constructed numerical example. So we're doing exactly the same diagram that you just saw with a price support, but I'm going to put some numbers to it. And the numbers I grabbed from the butter market. And these are numbers that applied probably some years ago, maybe 10 or even 15 or 20 years ago. And this is referring to the wholesale price of butter. And there are price supports in the butter market in the United States. Now, some years the price supports don't bite because the price is actually higher than the price support price that's been listed. But in some years it actually activates and the government has to buy up surplus butter. Now, at one time in the United States, the price support for butter production was around $1.05 per pound of butter, I think. And that would be the wholesale price, not the retail price that you actually pay at the store. All right, so what I'm using here are numbers that I've drawn to kind of match a little bit closely or approximately to the real values in the butter market at one time. All right, and I've also picked out approximately how many pounds of butter per week are actually bought and sold in the US market. And this, again, probably is dated 10 or 20 years ago. I'm not sure what the numbers actually are now. But I want to put this out there to sort of give you an idea of the scale of the price supports, like how much prices are supported relative to what might be the free market price. And notice what I'm indicating here is that the free market price might have been at a price of like 90 cents per pound, whereas the price support is up at $1.05 per pound. That would be typical, right? The price support is raising the price relative to equilibrium, not very much, just 15 cents per pound of butter. Maybe even less in a lot of circumstances. But this is the example I'm going to work with. All right, and the amount of consumption of butter is in the neighborhood of 3, 4, 5 million pounds per week. So these, again, are just kind of approximate values, not completely true, but in the order of magnitude of what actually occurs in the real world. Okay, so let's go forward with them. Now, let's calculate the effects of the surplus changes numerically now. So we've got numbers associated with all of these intersections, and we can calculate the areas of A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever of these areas. We can figure out the areas by doing a little bit of math now. So let's do that. The change in consumer surplus, once again, is given by area B plus C. Now, take note here that the graph here is not drawn to scale. So we've got 3 and 4 listed here. So 3 to 4 is this distance. Notice that it's much smaller right here. So this really extends way over here to the left. But I've just sort of broken up the axis so that we're just looking at this in the range of interest for us. And the same thing is true on the vertical axis. It's not drawn to scale. And that's okay, because all we're really going to need are the numbers associated with the values around this particular intersection. So it's going to work for us. Now, B plus C, how do we calculate the area of B and C? Well, area B is given by the height times the base. And area B is going to be 105 minus 90, that's going to be the 15 cents, times the 3 here, which is in million pounds per week, so 3 million. And then that's a negative sign because it's a minus B. And then we're going to subtract off the area C. Now, area C is a triangle, so it's 1/2 base times height. It's 1/2 the base, which is this. That's going to be the 0.5 million pounds or 500,000. Okay, and that's the 3.5 minus 300,000 here. That's the base. And then the height is given by the 105 minus 0.9, which is the 0.15, 15 cents, multiplied by 1/2 to get the area of the triangle. Add those two up together, And it's going to work out to be an amount of loss to consumers of close to $500,000 per week, 487.5. But let's annualize it. If we multiply that by 52 weeks per year, we're talking about a loss to consumers during the course of the year. These are butter consumers only, to the tune of about $24.5 million is lost to consumers in the course of a year, just from a 15-cent increase in the price of a pound of butter. Okay, let's go on. Producer surplus changes. Producer surplus is given by area plus BCD. So the producers are going to become better off. Let's measure how much. First, area BCD is going to be 487.5. That's the number I got from B and C in the previous exercise. Okay, so I'm just going to add that in, 487.5, and now I got to calculate the area of area D here. Now, area D is going to be 1/2 base times height. The base is going to be this distance. That's going to be 4 million minus 3 million. That's what this is here. The height here is going to be measured by the difference of 105 to 90, so that's where the 0.15 comes in. And then it's a triangle, so it's going to be 1/2 base times height. So we add that up, do the calculations, add it to the 487.5, and we're going to end up with a benefit to producers of $562,000 and plus some change per week. If we annualize that, we're going to get to $29.2 million extra is going to be earned by firms in the butter industry as a result of just that 15-cent increase in price coming about because of the price support. Now, government revenue effect. I'm going to do it the first way, where we essentially assume that here's what happens. The government takes all the butter and they turn it into big butter cows that they then present at the state fairs, and then they throw all that butter away at the end. So it costs taxpayers the amount given by area C, D, F, G, I, and J, this area here. And to calculate that area, we're going to do the following. I'm going to calculate area C is going to be equal to this area here. F plus I can calculate this area quite easily. That's given by this right here. It's going to be the 0.9 vertical distance times the base, which is 500,000 units. And then I'm going to take note that this area, C, F, and I, is exactly equal to this area here, because this distance is the same on the base, and this distance is exactly the same, and this distance is the same for both CF and I is the same as C, G, and J. So I'm going to use that method to recognize that if I know CF and I is 487, it's the sum of these, then G and J also has to be 487.5. And then I can add those together to get the answer, which is that the change in government revenue is going to be a little bit short of $1 million per week that the taxpayers are going to be in for. Annualize that, it comes to $54 million per year to support the 15-cent increase in the butter market. Okay, now we add up the consumer surplus effects here, plus the producer surplus effects here, plus the government revenue effects, and we get an annualized market welfare change of about negative $50 million per year is lost to the economy. It's kind of like money that just runs down into the sewer and drains off into the river. You lose it forever. So $50 million worth of benefits are suddenly wiped out from the economy because of the butter support program that's been put into place. Now, that's going to be lower, of course, if the government can, in the future, sell the butter. But that's going to come later, and it's not going to eliminate the loss. It's still going to be a market welfare loss to the economy overall, even if the government sells all of the butter in the future. Okay, now, here's where we get to Olson's impact. And thinking about the sizes of these individual interest groups, we can think of a collective being the consumers as one collective, the producers of butter, the second collective, and the taxpayers, a third collective. But here I'm going to note, I took a look at a trade association for the butter industry, and it's called the American Butter Institute. And if you look at their webpage, they will say that they have 27 firms that are participating in the trade association called the American Butter Institute, 27 firms. A few years ago when I looked, I think it was 25, so I used that number here. And they point out that those 27 butter firms make up about 90% of the butter market in America. Okay, so 25 firms make up most of the butter sales in the US economy. That is a small group in relative terms. But then, how many consumers are there of butter? And remember, you may not buy butter directly in the market all the time, but you've got butter in restaurant meals that you go to. You've got butter in pastries that you might buy. You've got butter in cookies that you might buy. So you've got butter in candy. You've got butter is everywhere. It's being used in all sorts of different ways. So how many people individually are likely to purchase some product during the year that has butter in it? A lot. It's going to be a lot of consumers in the US. So I made up a number. This is absolutely made up. 200 million, let's say. A large group of consumers are consuming some amount of butter. Some more, some less, but a lot of people are touched by the butter price. How many taxpayers are there? I don't know. I made up a number here. We've got 330 million people in the US economy. Some of them are children, not really responsible for taxes. But I'm going to add them in there and just say, okay, 300 million people is the total amount of individuals affected by the taxes they pay. All right, now let's calculate the annual impact per unit, where the units are one firm, one consumer, and one taxpayer. What happens? What we end up with is that the annual impact per butter firm, the major butter firms of this price support program, just 15 cents per pound of butter, but it's going to lead to a $1.17 million increase in revenues or profits to the firm as a result of that price support program compared to a free market. Okay, so each butter firm is going to make an enormous amount of extra money as a result of this price support program. Consumers, what about them? If we take the number, and the number is what? What the number for consumers is $24.5 million per year is being lost to consumers. But when you take that per 200 million consumers, it works out to only 12 cents extra per year. It's nothing. Consumers don't have to pay. They're not even going to notice that. Notice the losses are dispersed, meaning that they're spread out across a large number of individuals so that each individual cost is likely to be very, very low. Now, my numbers are actually quite a lot lower than other people that have done this kind of calculation. But you will see things like, the butter support program might cost the average consumer, $2 or $3 per year, a lot bigger than my number. But even $2 or $3 per year is like, you're not going to notice that in the grand scheme of things as a butter consumer. You're not going to know that the price is even higher because of the price support program. It's all going to fly under the radar for you. And again, it's because the losses are spread out across a large number of people. Same thing is true for the taxpayers. Taxpayers are paying money for this price support program. It's coming out of the government budget, but that government budget, remember, is like $4 trillion, $5 trillion a year is what the federal government is bringing in. And what is my butter support program going to cost? Here, $50 million per year. That's nothing. That's just a little bit of pocket change for the government. All right, and we spread it out across all the taxpayers. 18 cents per year per person is being lost to the taxpayer because of this support program. All right, so what do we make of this? What's the implication? Now, let's talk about lobbying and let's talk about collective action. How do we make a decision about whether to put this price support program into place or not? All right, in the United States, it's a democracy. Every person has the right to petition the government. So free speech, you're allowed to go to the government, talk to your representatives, your officials, say, this is what I think is in our interest, my interest, whatever, and you're allowed to talk to your government officials. That's just right. It's the way a democracy has to work. So I'm not disputing that particular point. That's just the reality. Representatives are elected to promote the interest of their constituents, right? So you get elected as a congressperson somewhere in America. Your first and fundamental duty is to your people, the people that have elected you to that particular office. And so you ought to rightfully open up your office and listen to them. Listen to what your constituents want, what they demand, desire from their government, because that's the way a representative democracy works. Okay, so now, let's suppose that amongst the huge number of policies that officials are considering at any point in time, that there's under consideration a price support policy like we've just analyzed for butter. Should we put the $5 price support into place for butter or not. All right, let's open it up for public discussion, we might say. Let's see what the people want. Now, the 25 butter firms each stand to gain over $1 million each, according to my numerical example. They each recognizing that they can make a whole lot more money for their individual firm, pay their employees more, they can take more vacations, they're going to make more profit. And they can take some of the expected benefit that they're going to get, that $1 million, and they can use it to fund something like a butter trade association. They could pay lobbyists in Washington who can then go to Washington and they're going to argue in support of this price support program, no doubt, because it's going to benefit the butter manufacturers. And that's what they are inclined to do. That's what they're allowed to do. And that's what they actually do. Okay, that's what the Butter Institute is there for, to monitor regulations and policies that the government is considering and to make sure that butter interests are heard. Okay, that's all fine. It's how the democracy is supposed to work. But what about the opposing side? We have suggested that the opposing side, the ones who are going to lose as a result of this policy, are going to lose even more than these beneficiaries are going to win, that the net effect is negative. But guess what? Representatives are unlikely to ever really know or hear very much about that, unless they talk to one of their economist friends, right? And why not? Well, because think about it. Imagine that you're trying to rally support from consumers to lobby the government against this price support program. Why? Because you want to benefit consumers. So you go out there and you try to convince everybody that this butter policy is wrong. And then when somebody asks you, well, how much am I losing? You say, well, it's about 12 cents a year. At that point, and then you say, how about coming to Washington, volunteer your time, write a couple letters to the congressman? What is a butter consumer going to do? They're going to say, I don't have time for that. I've got other things to do that I'm more worried about. I'm not going to be bothered by 12 cents loss. It's just not enough for me to get worried about. All right? So that's what they're going to do. And the taxpayers too. Taxpayers aren't even going to know that they're negatively affected. And if you could get a few people to get together and try to create a collective action to try to support their interests, it's going to be really hard to push off, to get going. And so what happens? Politicians who open their doors to their constituents and just say, I'm going to listen to everybody who comes in my door, and I'm going to try to promote policies that my constituents want. They're going to hear from the butter producers. They're not going to hear the opposition consideration at all. And so what do they think is going to be best for their constituents? Support the butter industry. Not only that, the $1 million extra here doesn't only go, I should point out, to support the butter trade association's efforts, but it might also be given to the politicians themselves in campaign contributions. Politicians need to raise money to maintain and to run their campaigns, especially representatives, every 2 years in the United States. And one thing that trade associations will often do is they will make contributions to certain politicians' political campaigns. Limited amounts because of the way our government regulations work, but they're still there. The firms that stand to profit also have extra money available to support the lobbying efforts and the political campaigns of politicians and to build up a good repertoire, a good rapport with individual politicians. That's the way Washington works. All right, so politicians are going to hear not the general story, not the aggregate story of the overall effects. They're not going to hear most of that. They're only going to learn that if they take an economics class, but they're not going to hear it from their individual constituents. All right, so the implication is that politicians who open their doors for all will only hear from the industry group most likely. Small groups, remember, Mansur Olson says, can collectivize, they can organize, they can get contributions to their effort, and that's going to help them. The policy will help the butter manufacturers. It will, this is the point I want to make. Politicians will often hear info then that's tilted in the favor of the firm interests. When the Butter Institute goes in to lobby for their interests, they're not going to say, oh, well, what about the consumers or what about the taxpayers? They're not going to point that out. They're going to say, look, it's going to help the butter manufacturers. They're going to say, hey, it's going to create jobs for us. We're going to be able to hire more people. This is good. And they're not really going to mention or talk very much about the consumer aggregate effects. That means that in a democracy, may tend to implement economic policies that favor concentrated beneficiaries. And those concentrated beneficiaries are almost always firms. Firms are going to benefit from the political system. Their voices are going to be heard, according to Olson, much more likely than the interests of consumers or the interests of the general interest, more likely across the economy. And that's why we get perhaps the policies that we get. Now, there is an extra reading I want to point your attention to. The extra reading is titled, Was Mansur Olson Wrong? And it's an interesting article because it highlights the fact that, you know what? Not every policy is actually tilted in favor of businesses. There are a lot of consumer protection policies and legislation that is put into place in the past. There is things like free trade agreements that countries have reached with other countries. And all of these tend to have positive economic effects in the aggregate rather than negative economic effects. So the article is suggesting that, you know, it's not as tilted to one direction as I just made out to be, for example. That there really are consumer groups and taxpayer groups who get listened to occasionally and who actually get their policies implemented. But what the article goes on to say is that Mansur Olson wouldn't really disagree with that. He's just saying that things are tilted in the direction of the firms and tilted against the consumer interests. So it doesn't mean it always works out that way. It's just more likely to work out in the interests of the concentrated beneficiaries rather than the dispersed losses to consumers and taxpayers. So I got a couple of slides there that I want to finish up with, but I want to show you what's on this slide, which is a list of industry trade groups in the United States and consumer organizations in the United States. All right, and I go to Wiki. So here's Wiki. Okay, so these are industry trade groups. So these are groups representing firms and lobbying the government for policies that might be in their particular favor. Okay, so here's advertising, business, marketing. There's a bunch of associations for them. There's a bunch of agricultural industries, energy industries, a whole bunch of different ones related. You know, look at some of these. The Pellet Fuels Institute, you know, the Atomic Industrial Forum, the Archery Trade Association, the Hotel Technology Next, on and on and on. All sorts of American Beverage Association, the Juice Products Association, construction, industry firms. These are some of the firms that are on K Street in Washington that have their people talking to politicians and monitoring and watching policies that are implemented by the government. All legal, all on the up and up, all valid. This is something that is just the way a democracy has got to work. Now let's take a look real quickly at consumer organizations. And I had trouble finding a list, but I found this page on Wikipedia called Consumer Organizations. Here's the list for the United States that they were able to come up with. They got about 15 consumer advocacy groups that are listed here. Consumer groups, really, really small number. They're there, but they're not very many. Producer groups, hundreds, thousands of groups that are advocating in support of business interests in America. All right, now I just want to comment a little bit because the issue that we raised last week in class is the issue of political economy. How do political decisions that affect economic outcomes, how do those decisions get made? And I presented to you a theory or idea that was attributed to an economist named Mansur Olson, who wrote a book about the logic of collective action. And it's a story about lobbying and how special interest groups form and how they bring information to the legislators in a democracy and call for changes in public policy, often to benefit themselves, but often also suggestive of the fact that, you know, even though this policy might benefit us, it's benefiting Americans more generally. It's benefiting the country more generally. Now, we talked a little bit about how the economic effects that we're displaying in our models are also tilted in a particular way, whereby some policies are likely to generate very large benefits for a relatively small group of people. And that's what I'm calling concentrated benefits or concentrated effects are likely to occur, like when a price support gets put into place, which was the policy we were looking at. All right, and so the farmers who are being subsidized, they're going to benefit quite noticeably. And they have because of that benefit, and because it's concentrated in the hands of a small number of units, they also have the potential to gain more profit, which can then be redirected into lobbying to try to get policies put into place that are actually going to help generate more profit. Now, to the extent that that happens, there's some other names that I want to highlight to you that are relating to this particular phenomenon. And one of them is called by economists in this first bullet point. Economists will sometimes call these activities directly unproductive activities. And another word that often gets used is this one right here, rent seeking. When we talk about rent seeking in an economy, we're talking about essentially this lobbying process where a group might get together, similar interests, and they will pool some funds and some monies to go to the legislature and try to implement policies that are going to generate more profits or more rents for them. Remember, monopoly profits are often referred to as rents. So trying to increase your monopoly position in the market is called or referred to as rent seeking. Now, there's another reference you'll sometimes hear, and especially since all of you are students at GW and will at some point be living on the GW campus, you'll often hear lots of references to K Street. And K Street is, a street a few blocks away from the GW campus, and it's a street filled with office buildings. Inside of many of those office buildings are law firms and trade associations and other lobbying groups that are positioned there because it's close to Capitol Hill, it's close to the White House, it's close to the decision making that takes place in Washington, D.C. And these are groups of individuals who are there to promote the interests of the organization that they're created around. Okay, now, economists often call these directly unproductive activities because these activities are not really creating any new goods and services for people. They're economic activity, and we measure it as a part of our gross domestic product, for example, but they're not creating new television sets or new services for people. Or what it's really designed to do, and the reason it's being funded, is because it generates the potential to actually increase the profitability of the interest groups that they're representing. And to the extent that it can raise those profits in the future, it makes sense for these firms to pool some of their money in order to lobby Congress for legislation that's going to work in their particular favor or their interests. Now, as we're suggested with the price support policy, if that's lobbied for and then enacted by legislatures, it's going to likely, in our economic analysis, it's likely to lead to more losses than gains, meaning that economic efficiency can actually be inspired and induced because the government, listening to lobby groups and feeling compelled that those are important changes that need to be made, go ahead and make these changes, but then are actually making things worse for the economy rather than better in the economy. Okay, and so we want to think a little bit about that more and think about, well, why do they do that? Why would they make these particular decisions? Now, I also want to highlight, though, a little bit about not going too far down this path to think that lobbying affects everything, or that it's as easy as just, you raise some money, you talk to some Congress people, and then suddenly you get laws written in your favor. It's not that easy. It takes a long time to get legislation passed. Congress people are constantly got lots of different interest groups that are competing for their time and their activities, and sometimes, it finally pays off. A lot of times it doesn't pay off, at least in the near term. And so these actions take place over a long period of time, and it can take a long time before lobbying efforts actually generate some benefits or some success on the other end. So it's not that easy for this lobbying process to work. But I will point out that the way in which laws get written these days, it's often in very close connection with the lobbying groups themselves, who are not only saying what policies might be good. A lot of times the lobby groups are actually the ones writing the legislation and then presenting it to Congress folks and saying, hey, take a look at this. This might be something you'd want to introduce in the next bill. It's also worth noting that all Congress people have a bunch of ideas and a bunch of new legislation kind of ready to go and ready to be submitted into potential bills, but it has to follow a process, and there's There's seniority, there's folks who have more power, those who have less power. You can't put everything into a new bill all at once. There's budget constraints that have to be considered. But there are times, like for example, this year with the COVID crisis, where suddenly a piece of legislation is proposed, like we need to have emergency funding for people because of the recession induced by the pandemic and because of the shutdowns, okay? So it's like, okay, government decides we need to do that. When they do that, though, what often happens is that all these legislators who've got these bills pending, considering to be put into different pieces of legislation, all kind of flood all these legislations, these new laws into the COVID bill. So the COVID bill, which might be very targeted and just focused on just fixing the economic decline that's happening, instead it gets littered with all of these extra amendments, extra bills, different parts, because everyone knows that if you put something in that might be objectionable otherwise, people can't vote against the COVID bill because they would be like voting against helping Americans in a crisis. And so this is one of the sort of debates that's currently taking place in Congress about whether we should have a new COVID bill or not, and how much spending is the government going to commit itself to, and how much is going to be thrown into that bill from the side because of legislations that have been sitting, waiting to be put into a bill for the last 2, 3, 5 years, and suddenly they all get thrown into this one bill because legislators are going to have difficulty voting against it. So anyway, this is just a little bit of an aside about how that lobbying process works and the kind of impacts it has in Washington. But I do also want to make a couple of comments about how lobbying has good outcomes. There are exceptions, this last bullet point, when lobbying will actually promote improvements in economic efficiency. So for example, free trade agreements or free trade promotion, Congress votes on those from time to time. We enter into new free trade agreements with other countries, and when we evaluate the economic impacts of that, it's quite likely to cause an improvement in economic efficiency rather than a reduction. So sometimes, as with the article, was Mansur Olson wrong in suggesting that only the powerful special interests get their way? Not always. Sometimes lobbying actually promotes, efficiency improving outcomes. And also, we can actually point to the fact that lobbying can serve a useful purpose in a democracy because legislators need to have information. They need to know what's going on out there in the world, and the information is going to come from their constituents. So we can't really, talk about lobbying and say, well, this is a bad thing, we got to get rid of it entirely, because that's also throwing out some of the good things that come with lobbying as well. We want to have people have free speech, to be able to petition the government for a redress of grievances, to propose new ideas. Lobbying fulfills that particular purpose and function. And we don't want to get rid of that in a democracy. That would be uncalled for. It's not consistent with the ideals of democracy. So we have this kind of dilemma that's created by the way in which the process works that we should be aware of. And we should be working and thinking about ways to minimize the sort of negative impacts that come from lobbying, while not necessarily seeking to get rid of it entirely, because that could limit the amount of free speech that people have in a democracy. Okay, I pointed to this at the end of class last time and just showed you the numerous industry trade groups that are listed oftentimes. And one of the caveats, or I guess one of the controls about lobbying that we have, is that lobbying groups are supposed to register. They're supposed to report their expenses. They're supposed to report what they're lobbying about and what issues. So trying to make that information more public and available to people is a part of the way in which our system works today. And that's one of the reasons why we have a wiki list of all of these special interest groups that are out there, and spending some money in one way or another to transmit information and or at least be aware of their particular special interests vis-a-vis new legislation that might be coming forward. Also highlighted the fact that there are very few consumer organizations that are fighting for just the general consumer interests. And Mansur Olson's argument about why dispersed losses to groups and large groups, in particular consumer groups across the country, are unlikely to have the ability to collectively organize and promote their interests in a very powerful way in a democratic system. And so we have very few consumer organizations working on the behalf of just consumers in the country. Worth noting that. Now, I want to highlight just a couple of things we've gone through now in the past. And again, highlighting the concentrated effects and dispersed effects of various actions. So the price support policy that we've been talking about last time in class on butter generates concentrated benefits to a small number of butter producers. And I want to highlight the fact that those effects are noticeable, right? Okay, those butter producers know when they get that extra $1 million per year because of the 15-cent price support that we investigated in our hypothetical numerical example. Okay, so those benefits are concentrated and noticeable, therefore. The losses, however, in that model were to butter consumers first off, but there's so many butter consumers that we highlighted before that, they might lose a few cents, in the extreme, maybe a couple of dollars per year. And that's not enough to be noticed, and it's not enough to rise up against or complain about. So there's dispersed losses to numerous butter consumers. There's also, because of the price support, that generates losses to taxpayers. But again, the butter industry and the expenses that are made are in the millions of dollars potentially in our example, and that is just a drop in the bucket for the federal budget. So therefore, taxpayers not even going to notice a little policy like this that gets put into place. The overall economic efficiency effect, economists would argue, to the extent that these markets are perfectly competitive, we're losing economic efficiency by putting this price support into place. But again, it's unnoticeable. Nobody can measure and feel the effects that are taking place across an entire economy. And so we have to base our evaluation of that on the economic models that are put together and give us some understanding of what those total effects are likely to be. It's kind of like with climate change. Nobody can feel climate change taking place. No one can, even in their lifetime, know for sure that it's taking place. Even if you've noticed some changes in weather patterns, that's not a change in the climate. The only way to measure climate change is with a measurement across many, many years, decades, even centuries, in order to, and it's got to be global measurements across the entire globe. And you got to bring all that together in order to make the case that climate change is indeed happening. But it's not something that any individual can personally feel. And so in that sense, the effects of climate change are unnoticeable to an individual. Okay, same way with a lot of government policies that get put into place. We can't feel or sense what the economic efficiency outcomes are likely to be. And so it's out of our mind and out of our consideration a lot of times. We focus on the effects that tend to be noticed. And in the case of a price support, the only thing noticed is going to be the benefits that are going to accrue to that small number of butter producers. And they're going to very likely say, what's good for us is good for the country, and therefore this is a perfectly good policy to be putting into place. Now let's go back one step. We talked about import tariffs. And recently in the Trump administration, Trump put import tariffs in place on steel and aluminum, arguing that it was a concern to our national security. Well, what does that import tariff on steel do? Well, it generates concentrated benefits to a small number of steel producers. They actually expand their production a little bit, create some jobs, and the measurement of that has been verified. Yes, steel producers did benefit from steel tariffs. But the losses to the country are spread out across numerous consumers of steel, so much as to be completely unnoticed by the average consumer. And I point your attention back to the Wilbur Ross YouTube video that was at the end of the trade section. And in that video, he talks about how, the price of an aluminum can or a tin can is going to go up by 0.6 cents as a result of their tariffs. And he's like, who cares about that? Nobody's going to notice that. Nobody's going to care. He's exactly right. But when we add up those small losses across millions and millions of consumers, it actually can add up to a lot more than the benefits that are accruing to the industry that you're trying to help with this policy. Okay, now there are dispersed benefits to numerous taxpayers. In this case, the disbursement has to do with the fact that it's taxpayers. In this case, with a tariff, the taxpayers are actually off the hook a little bit because money is being collected with the tariff. But still, it's going to be unnoticeable because of the dispersed nature of those benefits that are accruing to them. So they don't know they're getting a little bit more money as a result of this, and maybe paying fewer taxes in the future as a result of this. So those effects are unnoticeable. And again, the losses of economic efficiency can't be noticed by an individual or even a small group. You have to do an aggregate measurement. You need to have a model in order to make an evaluation about what those overall economic effects are likely to be. And most people will not notice that. Okay, now, let me do a comparison, because I want to put this into context with other situations we've looked at. And I want to remind you about the Trojan app and the Happy app example that I did earlier in the class. This is coming back to affect our evaluation now, to put some perspective on things. Remember the Trojan app. The Trojan app was an individual writes a program that breaks into the bank accounts of every individual in the country and takes out 0.0001% or something of their deposit. So little that nobody even notices that money is being taken out. Well, what happens? There's a concentrated benefit to the Trojan app creator, and that's very noticeable because he or she is becoming fabulously wealthy because of this scheme. There are dispersed losses to lots of bank depositors who lose just a little bit of money, but it's so little that nobody is likely to notice this particular theft. And then lastly, what's the total effect? Well, it's a pure transfer or redistribution. The Trojan app creator is becoming fabulously wealthy, and he's taking just a little bit of happiness away from lots and lots of people. So it's just moving happiness out of the hands or pockets of one group, large group of people, into the pockets or hands of one Trojan app creator slash thief. Right now, the Trojan app is not allowed. It's not legal. No one should do it. But I want to use this as a comparison to the other ones we're talking about. I mean, look at what happens when you lobby for a price support on butter. Generates concentrated benefit to a small number of butter producers, and a bunch of people lose in such a way that nobody notices it. Very similar in terms of its effects, right? But the Trojan app is clearly illegal, while lobbying your Congress folk for, policies that are going to benefit you at the expense of a larger whole, that's not illegal. You're perfectly welcome to do that in a democracy. All right, now, the Happy app, let me talk about that again. Remember, that was where an individual sells an app on your phone, like a TikTok app, that generates benefits to people, and they sell it. I made up the story of $1 per purchase a subscription to the TikTok-like Happy app. All right, now what's that going to do? It's going to generate concentrated benefits to the Happy app creator, the innovator, and that's going to be very noticeable to him or her because they're going to become wealthy. In our story, they made $150 million or something as a result of selling the Happy app to 150 million people for $1 each. Now, the benefits are dispersed, but they're noticeable because every individual Happy app consumer had to make a personal decision about whether to spend the $1 or not spend the $1. So even though the benefits are dispersed, it's obvious to the Happy app consumer that they paid this money and received a benefit in exchange. So here we get the dispersed benefits here's a case where it's noticeable. And then overall economic efficiency, well, you don't really notice that it's going on, that lots of people are benefiting, but you know that you benefited because you willingly gave over the dollar to receive the Happy app. And the Happy app creator is benefiting. It's a pure exchange between Smith and Jones-like situation, where both sides are walking away happier, knowing that they made an exchange and both became better off as a result of that. All right, now I want to talk about just a couple of other sort of situations that we can put this argument put it around. So recently, the Trump administration has been pushing for policy changes from China. And China's coming under increasing pressure to change the way they do business internationally because it's alleged that they're causing harm and damage to the US. Okay, so one of those has to do with a demand that China reduce its intellectual property violations. Okay, and one of those has to do with China expecting that new companies that come from abroad, that they bring their technology and that they license it and make it available to the Chinese partners that they're joining in with. Okay, and companies have felt under enormous amount of pressure or stress to sort of sign over the rights of their intellectual property, on their process innovations and so forth, to the Chinese companies, who then might take that intellectual property and open up new plants and compete with them in that particular area. Now, there's some other allegations of pure theft that China might be undertaking in terms of breaking into computer systems of companies and trying to steal intellectual property and ideas from them in that particular way. That's very different from sort of pressuring someone to voluntarily give you license to use a particular technology and so forth. But these are some of the claims that have been made against China. Now, and I just want to highlight what that would do for Americans. And note that who's pushing for this review of China and their intellectual property violations? Well, it's the pharmaceutical companies and the technology companies who are being pressured to transfer their technology or their ideas to the Chinese firms if they want to engage and participate in the Chinese market. Okay, so they're saying we got to get China to clamp down to enforce their intellectual property rights provisions so as to benefit American firms. That's where the pressure is coming from. Now, if China changes their intellectual policies, property policies in order to abide by that, then US pharma companies and tech companies are going to be very happy about that. It's going to be a noticeable positive effect for US companies. But what about the losses to the US? Well, the losses are going to come because to the extent that we don't allow information to transmit to other companies, if the costs cannot be brought down across the board, across companies across the world, then you're going to inspire monopoly rights or privileges amongst those who hold intellectual property rights, for example, US companies. But if we allowed intellectual property and ideas to spread out, lots of firms pick them up, lots of competition takes place, that's actually going to bring prices of things like pharmaceuticals down. It's going to bring the prices of technology goods down, and it's going to benefit the consumers in America of healthcare products and technology. So by charging China and trying to enforce their intellectual property provisions more strongly, it's worth recognizing that we are working to benefit the monopoly privileges of US firms at the expense of US consumers, who would probably be better off to the extent that intellectual property violations occur more widely internationally. Because again, ideas spread out, going to more mimic a perfectly competitive market economy. It's going to bring costs down for everybody. It's going to bring monopoly profits down for the large companies. And it can have that general positive effect to economic efficiency going forward. Now, what about the economic effects overall? I'm leaving them as uncertain here because you've got the argument for intellectual property protections that it's actually good in the longer term because it stimulates innovation. And to the extent that that's true, we want to maintain some intellectual property protections for some firms. But to the extent that it's not true, and again, it is contentious about which of these effects is stronger. To the extent that it's not true, it's actually reducing economic efficiency and reducing the well-being of individuals within the US economy to the extent that we promote this particular policy. Okay, so this is some of the considerations that we have to make in evaluating policies and evaluating the charges that are being made and brought against other countries in terms of legislation that we implement and so forth and so on.